I am Julian Vance, 31 years old. 10 minutes ago, I watched my own mother crush enough heavy-duty cardiac medication into my dinner drink to stop a charging rhino's heart in its tracks. While I was working grueling 12-hour night shifts at the County Hospital Trauma Center just to keep the bank from foreclosing on the roof over their heads, my parents looked at my brother and said, "Julian owes this family his paycheck, but Preston deserves the entire world." They humiliated me at every single Thanksgiving dinner in front of 25 extended family members, loudly joking to the room that I was the family pack mule who wasn't smart enough to be a real businessman. But there is one thing they didn't know. They didn't know I had plugged a specialized, high-definition hidden camera into the kitchen wall outlet, and they certainly didn't know that the real estate deed to the house they were sitting in was already solely, legally registered in my name alone. And right now, my mother and father are sitting inside a Concrete County jail cell, sobbing and begging for my legal mercy. Before I tell you how the golden child willingly snatched his own lethal poison across the dining room table, hit that like button if you truly believe that karma never misses an address. And please, drop a quick comment below telling me what state or country you are watching this video from today. Now, let's go back to the polished dining room table where the ultimate trap was set. The condensation on the heavy crystal glass was freezing against the pads of my fingers. Across the heavy oak dining table, the exact same table I had paid out of my own pocket to have professionally refinished after my younger brother Preston left permanent white rings from his cheap beer cans all over the wood, my mother sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her name is Eleanor. She was wearing her Sunday church blouse, the pale pastel blue one she always put on whenever she wanted to project the false image of a delicate, fragile suburban matriarch who spent her peaceful afternoons baking rhubarb pies and praying for the neighborhood. "Drink up, Julian, sweetheart," she said. Her voice was dripping with that thick, artificial honey she manufactured whenever she was preparing to extract a massive financial favor. "It's a very special, exclusive ginseng herbal tonic. I bought it at that high-end organic market downtown. It's for your chronic stress, honey. You've been working so many terrible, exhausting hours at the clinic." She slowly slid the dark, thick green liquid across the polished wood. I did not blink. I kept my resting heart rate entirely steady, drawing on the years of rigorous, high-pressure clinical training I had endured as an emergency room triage specialist. In my specific line of work, when a critically injured patient rolls through the double doors with a severed femoral artery, you do not panic. You do not scream. You check the monitor, you apply a tourniquet, and you stop the bleeding. Right now, I was staring directly at a catastrophic internal hemorrhage disguised as a mother's warm affection. My mother did not know that 10 minutes prior, while sitting inside my parked car 2 blocks away from the house, I had opened a live, encrypted video feed on my smartphone. She did not know I had watched her pull an amber prescription bottle of digoxin out of her woven leather handbag, dump 20 tiny white pills into a heavy granite mortar, and grind them into a fine, unmistakable chalky powder. Digoxin is a heavy-duty cardiac glycoside. In strict, microscopic medical dosages, it helps a failing, weakened heartbeat with regular rhythm. But in the massive, unmeasured handful my mother had just whisked into my expensive organic juice, it induces severe hyperkalemia, profound bradycardia, and total, irreversible cardiac arrest within 30 to 45 minutes. She needed my life insurance payout cleared into her checking account by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, or the local underground loan sharks were going to take their delinquent payment out of my father's kneecaps. I looked down at the dark green liquid. The pungent, earthy aroma of the organic ginseng perfectly masked the bitter, chemical undertone of the crushed prescription medicine. Then, I shifted my gaze slightly to my left. Sitting there was Preston, 26 years old, the golden child. He was wearing a pristine, $300 designer polo shirt that I had indirectly paid for when I covered my mother's severely overdrawn checking account the previous month. His bright blue eyes were locked onto my crystal glass with pure, unadulterated, childish envy. Preston possessed the emotional maturity of a territorial toddler. In his mind, anything exclusive, anything carrying a heavy price tag, and anything placed directly in front of someone else rightfully belonged to him. I let a slow, perfectly calm, knowing smile spread across my face. I picked up the heavy crystal glass by the stem, gently swirling the dark tonic, just enough to let the dining room chandelier catch the thick texture. "Wow, Mom," I said, deliberately pitching my voice so the sound carried right into Preston's fragile, hyper-inflated ego. "You finally bought the expensive stuff for me." I knew the exact psychological triggers to pull. But to truly understand why I was completely willing to sit there in silence and let the golden child reach for his own execution, you have to understand the architecture of a household built entirely on utility. Time seemed to stretch into a slow-motion crawl as Preston's jaw tightened. I watched his manicured fingers twitch against his white linen dinner napkin. While he sat there silently boiling over the perceived injustice that his older brother was receiving a $20 luxury beverage, I looked right past him. Every toxic family operates on a strict, unspoken caste system. If you grew up inside one, you already know the designated roles by heart. There is always the ornament and there is always the utility. Preston was our family's ornament. From the very day he was brought home from the maternity ward, he was treated like a priceless, fragile porcelain artifact that belonged inside a locked, dust-free museum display case. He was handsome, charming in a reckless, manipulative sort of way, and entirely exempt from the fundamental concept of personal accountability. When Preston failed his freshman college courses, my parents loudly blamed the university professors for lacking emotional intelligence. When Preston completely totaled his first automobile, a used Honda Civic I had spent 2 grueling undergraduate summers saving up to purchase for him, my father patted his shoulder, bought him a ribeye steak dinner, and told him the municipal road conditions were notoriously hazardous. Preston existed solely to be paraded around at neighborhood block parties and holiday barbecues. He was introduced to everyone as the future real estate developer, even though his entire professional portfolio consisted of sleeping until noon and losing borrowed money on unregulated crypto day trading platforms. I, on the other hand, was the utility. I was the underground concrete foundation of the structure. Nobody admires the raw concrete foundation of a residential building. They simply expect it to bear the immense physical weight of the roof without developing a single crack. I was the child who fixed the leaking, rusted plumbing in the downstairs guest bathroom because my father, Richard, had gambled away the seasonal home maintenance budget on off-track thoroughbred racing. I was the one who quietly logged into my online banking portal to pay off the exorbitant credit card balances my mother maxed out during her essential self-care getaways to Cabo San Lucas. For almost 31 years, I suffered from a severe terminal case of good son syndrome. I fundamentally believed that if I just worked enough overtime, if I solved enough domestic catastrophes, and if I signed over enough of my bi-weekly salary, my parents would eventually look at me with the exact same unconditional warmth they showered upon Preston. I mistakenly equated being needed with being loved. It is the most devastating, insidious psychological trap an eldest child can fall into. You give, and you sacrifice your own personal boundaries until your entire human identity is completely swallowed up by your functional utility. My parents viewed my endless compliance as pathetic weakness. They honestly believed I stayed inside that suffocating suburban split level because I was desperate for their parental validation. They treated me like a 24-hour commercial ATM that happened to possess a valid registered nursing license. What Richard and Eleanor utterly failed to realize was that while I was dutifully writing the checks to keep our family out of bankruptcy court, I was also meticulously filing away the receipts. I am a remarkably organized man. When you spend your entire professional career managing complex clinical patient charts, administering exact pharmaceutical dosages, and documenting triage timelines, you develop an instinct for permanent records. I maintained a secure, encrypted digital folder containing every single bank wire confirmation, every cleared utility statement, and every municipal property tax assessment I had covered since the day I turned 22. The heavy blindfold didn't just gently slip off my face. It was violently, permanently ripped away exactly 60 days ago, on a freezing Tuesday evening that smelled of burnt hospital coffee and impending domestic ruin. And trust me, what happened on that specific Tuesday was the exact biological trigger that transformed me from a compliant, self-sacrificing son into their cold, unblinking executioner. 2 months ago, I dragged my exhausted body up the cracked concrete driveway of our suburban home after completing a brutal, soul-crushing 12-hour shift at the county medical center. My feet felt like heavy lead weights inside my white nursing clogs. I had spent the last 4 hours performing relentless physical chest compressions on a cardiac arrest victim and actively dodging the demeaning, endless verbal criticisms of Dr. Sterling, the hospital's arrogant chief of cardiology who had just summarily denied my hard-earned senior triage promotion because he preferred promoting compliant administrative sycophants over dedicated floor nurses. I was dreaming of nothing more than a scalding hot shower and 6 hours of uninterrupted, dreamless sleep. But as I reached the top step of the front porch, the bright, aggressive neon yellow glare of a legal document caught my eye. It was securely taped directly over the brass peephole of our front door. It was a formal municipal notice of foreclosure and sheriff's sale. I stood there in the biting evening wind, my tired eyes scanning the dense columns of legal boilerplate. My stomach did a cold, violent flip. According to the county clerk's official records, my father had completely defaulted on the primary residential mortgage payments for the past 6 consecutive months. We were exactly 48 hours away from a public county auction, 48 hours away from a team of armed sheriff's deputies arriving to forcefully drag my childhood bed, my medical textbooks, and my mother's antique dining room display cabinets out onto the front lawn for the entire neighborhood to photograph. I pushed the heavy oak door open. The atmosphere inside the house was thick with a frantic, suffocating, theatrical panic. My mother, Eleanor, was sitting at the central marble kitchen island, hysterically sobbing into a crumpled wad of paper towels. But as I stepped onto the hardwood floor, I registered the absolute, staggering absurdity of her grief. She wasn't crying because we were about to lose our permanent family shelter. She was crying because she was scheduled to host the Regional Homeowners Association Garden Club luncheon the following Tuesday, and she couldn't bear the perceived social humiliation of issuing a cancellation notice. "Where am I supposed to arrange the imported hydrangeas, Richard?" she wailed, her voice cracking with melodramatic, piercing despair. "The ladies from the gated community down the street will talk about this domestic embarrassment until Thanksgiving. We will be absolute social outcasts. Our family name will be ruined." My father, Richard, was actively pacing the length of the living room Persian rug like a trapped, sweating predator. His graying hair was disheveled, and his Oxford shirt collar was completely unbuttoned. When he heard my heavy nursing clogs against the floorboards, he didn't offer a word of genuine parental apology. He didn't look at me with the profound shame of a traditional family provider who had recklessly steered his household into total financial insolvency. He simply stopped pacing, pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my sternum, and issued an absolute, non-negotiable command. "Fix it immediately, Julian," he snapped. His tone wasn't a desperate plea for domestic assistance. It was the sharp, entitled bark of a plantation overseer addressing a common laborer. "You've been hoarding your clinical salary inside that high-yield savings account for 3 years. I know you have the liquid capital. Wire the delinquent arrears to the bank's legal department tomorrow morning before the commercial branches open." I stood completely frozen in the formal entryway. The deep physical exhaustion in my bones suddenly evaporated, replaced by a strange, crystal-clear, icy stillness. For the very first time in my adult life, I looked at my father not as a towering, protective family patriarch to be inherently respected, but as a small, pathetic, reckless man who would happily drain my life savings dry and then loudly complain that the financial bandages I provided weren't brand name. "Do you have any earthly idea how much 6 months of delinquent mortgage arrears, compounded municipal interest, and bank legal fees amount to, Dad?" I asked, my voice dropping into a remarkably flat, dangerous register. "It's exactly $50,000. That is my entire liquid emergency fund. That is the exact college fund I spent the last 4 years building, so I could finally enroll in the nurse practitioner graduate program." "Graduate school?" Richard scoffed, waving his hand with extreme, dismissive contempt. "You're already making an entirely adequate salary cleaning up bodily fluids. Your mother's social standing in this subdivision is on the line here. This household comes first. You owe us for the groceries you consumed, the medical insurance we provided, and the physical roof over your head for the last 31 years. I looked across the island at my mother, who had temporarily ceased her theatrical sobbing just long enough to peer at me through her ruined, mascara-stained eyelashes, eagerly waiting for my psychological resolve to crumble. Then I looked into the formal living room at Preston, who was sprawled out horizontally across the sectional sofa, idly scrolling through TikTok dance trends on his pristine iPhone, completely, blissfully unbothered by the undeniable fact that the roof over his head was currently owned by a commercial lending institution. "I will settle the account," I said slowly, measuring every single syllable. My father let out a loud, heavy, arrogant sigh of physical relief, instantly reassuming his default posture of unearned domestic superiority. "Excellent. Ensure the wire transfer confirmation is on my desk by noon. On one strict legal condition," I added, stepping fully under the warm glow of the entryway chandelier. "The three of us are going to visit Mrs. Higgins at the downtown public notary office at exactly 2 o'clock this afternoon. I will hand over a certified cashier's check for $50,000 to permanently satisfy the bank's legal department. But simultaneously, both of you are going to execute a formal, irrevocable quitclaim deed. You are going to legally, permanently transfer 100% of the real estate title of this residential property solely into my name." The entire living room went dead, terrifyingly silent. You could clearly hear the faint, rhythmic physical ticking of the antique grandfather clock down the hallway. "Are you completely insane?" Richard bellowed, his face violently flushing a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. "You want to use our temporary financial distress to steal our family estate?" "I am purchasing the asset, Richard," I replied coldly, intentionally stripping away the unearned title of Dad. "The commercial bank is about to seize it for absolutely nothing. You have a very simple choice to make. You can sign the real estate deed over to me, retain your public dignity, and let Eleanor host her precious garden club luncheon. Or you can begin packing your suitcases tonight. I will keep my $50,000 in my account and use it to place a substantial down payment on a luxury high-rise condominium downtown, while the county sheriff physically unbolts your front door." They raged. They screamed. My mother staged an elaborate hyperventilation episode that belonged on a syndicated television drama. But by exactly 1:45 that afternoon, my parents were sitting meekly across the polished oak desk from Mrs. Higgins, the 80-year-old razor-sharp public notary whose downtown office smelled heavily of peppermint lozenges, old legal archives, and stale binding glue. They signed the complex transfer documents with furious, violently shaking hands. They signed because they were facing immediate street eviction, but substantially more importantly, they signed because they were profoundly, incurably arrogant. In their twisted, highly narcissistic minds, a formal legal deed was nothing more than a temporary, meaningless piece of municipal paper. They genuinely believed that because they maintained complete ownership of my psychological good son compliance, they inherently still owned the underlying real estate asset. They figured they could easily manipulate, guilt trip, or emotionally coerce me into transferring the property title back into their names once their financial storm blew over. Mrs. Higgins firmly pressed the heavy brass corporate seal into the thick parchment. As she slid the finalized, legally binding real estate deed across the desk into my hands, she looked up and caught my eye. That elderly woman had spent 50 years witnessing ugly domestic disputes, bitter commercial divorces, contested custody agreements, and vicious family probate lawsuits. She gave me a slow, incredibly somber, knowing nod of her head, a silent, powerful warning that clearly said, "Watch your back, young man. These people are malignant." That notarized signature was the very first heavy steel nail driven directly into their domestic coffins. The second nail arrived exactly 2 weeks later, and it brought with it the loud, obnoxious entrance of my father's older sister, Aunt Patricia. If Eleanor was the quiet, crying architect of our domestic manipulation, Aunt Patricia was its loud, aggressive chief enforcer. She was an overbearing, highly critical woman who wore heavy gold costume jewelry and smelled aggressively of cheap synthetic lavender perfume. She rattled the front door open, marching directly into the kitchen and enveloping Preston in a massive, suffocating physical embrace while loudly praising him for his imaginary business acumen. I just know your new commercial investment venture is going to be a massive financial success. Preston, honey, Patricia trumpeted, deliberately pitching her abrasive voice loud enough to echo down the hallway to where I was sitting at the dining room table, quietly mending the separated leather sole of my clinical work boots with a heavy, curved suturing needle and thick black nylon thread. You simply possess the natural Vance entrepreneurial vision. Not everyone is intellectually equipped to be an executive innovator. Some people in this world are just biologically destined to be common worker bees. She slowly turned her heavy head, fixing me with a venomous, deeply condescending glare from the kitchen threshold. I heard all about the disgusting legal stunt you pulled on your poor parents, Julian, she hissed, marching over to stand directly above my chair. Forcing your own flesh and blood to sign over the permanent title to their home just to assist them through a minor temporary cash flow disruption? It's entirely reprehensible. In traditional American families, the eldest son inherently honors his parents. He provides for their retirement. He doesn't hold their temporary financial miscalculations over their heads like a greedy, grasping commercial slumlord. I kept my steady eyes firmly focused on my curved needle, aggressively driving the steel through the tough, unyielding work leather. If I hadn't stepped in with my liquid savings, Aunt Patricia, your beloved brother and sister-in-law would be living inside your spare bedroom right now. Are you officially volunteering to assume the monthly municipal property taxes, the structural maintenance costs, and the utility autodrafts? Patricia's heavily lipsticked mouth opened and closed silently like a landed freshwater base before she let out an indignant, scoffing gasp. That is entirely beside the point. The fundamental issue is basic family loyalty. You possess a cold, transactional heart, Julian. It's absolutely no wonder Chloe canceled the wedding. The entire dining room went utterly still. My right hand froze completely mid-stitch. Chloe. Just hearing her name spoken out loud inside that toxic house felt like a jagged, rusty piece of scrap iron twisting directly inside my chest. 2 years ago, Chloe and I were exactly 90 days away from exchanging our formal wedding vows. We had secured a beautiful, intimate lakeside venue. I loved her with a fierce, quiet, protective devotion. But one Sunday evening, I returned home from the hospital floor to find her diamond engagement ring sitting alone on the kitchen counter next to a brief, tear-stained handwritten letter. She didn't walk away because our romantic connection had faded. She fled because she had uncovered a sickening, unforgivable family secret. Without my knowledge or consent, my father, Richard, had tracked Chloe down at her corporate office. She was a senior commercial loan underwriter at a regional credit union. He had broken down and manufactured hysterical tears in her lobby, falsely claiming that I was facing imminent criminal prosecution stemming from a delinquent undergraduate financial liability, and that I needed $20,000 in immediate liquid cash to avoid a mandatory county jail sentence. He actively begged her not to mention the meeting to me, deeply playing upon her protective romantic instincts. Chloe had immediately executed a high-interest personal signature loan to hand him the cash. It took her exactly 3 months of audit investigation to realize Richard had blown every single dollar on illegal, high-stakes underground poker tables, and that I was completely, blissfully oblivious to the entire financial extortion. When Chloe angrily confronted him in our driveway, Richard laughed directly in her face and calmly informed her that once she officially married into the Vance family, her corporate paycheck belonged to the collective domestic pot anyway. Chloe looked at the terrifying reality of marrying me. A man so deeply enmeshed inside his parents' domestic financial black hole that his own father would ruthlessly extort his future wife, and she exercised her absolute right to self-preservation. I couldn't even harbor a single ounce of resentment toward her. When I confronted Richard about completely destroying my impending marriage, he simply shrugged his shoulders, popped a small handful of salted peanuts into his mouth and said, "If the girl was scared off that easily by domestic financial sharing, son, she wasn't emotionally tough enough to be a Vance wife anyway. You saved money on a divorce lawyer." I looked up from my broken leather work boot, staring directly into Aunt Patricia's sneering, self-righteous eyes. The staggering visual contrast of that living room hit my consciousness with the extreme physical force of a swinging wrecking ball. Over on the plush sectional sat Preston, idly tossing a pristine set of keys to a brand new leased BMW. A commercial auto lease my mother had quietly co-signed using her credit profile. He was wearing spotless, $300 designer sneakers that had never touched municipal dirt. And here I sat, a highly educated, experienced clinical professional, physically sewing the sole of my work shoe back together just so I could walk the intensive care units without the biological floor fluids soaking into my socks. I didn't argue with Patricia. I didn't waste my breath defending Chloe's pristine reputation to a woman biologically incapable of experiencing human empathy. I simply snipped the heavy black nylon thread with my medical shears, stood up to my full height, and looked my aunt dead in the eye. "You are entirely correct, Patricia," I said softly, my voice devoid of any human inflection. "I am a completely cold man now, and you should keep that historical fact firmly in mind the next time your brother calls your house crying for a financial bailout." I grabbed my repaired boots and walked out of the room, but deep inside my chest, the lingering, painful ghost of my stolen future with Chloe officially hardened into an unbreakable, diamond-hard resolve. I was permanently done functioning as the sacrificial domestic lamb for their endless altar of vanity. I thought that realizing my parents were financial parasites was the absolute bottom of the psychological barrel. I thought the worst emotional devastation was finally behind me. I was so incredibly, fatally wrong, because 2 weeks later, the true Category 5 emotional storm made landfall, and it brought with it a staggering, lethal family betrayal that made the painful loss of my home and my fiancé look like a gentle, affectionate warm-up. 2 weeks ago, the fragile, deeply suffocating domestic truce inside our household finally shattered into a million permanent, unfixable splinters. It was a crisp, clear Friday evening. I walked into the living room holding a sleek, black leather corporate portfolio containing finalized real estate closing documents and certified municipal tax receipts. I stood calmly by the brick fireplace, quietly waiting for my mother to lower her glossy interior design publication and for my father to mute the blaring post-game sports broadcast. "I have a formal administrative announcement," I said clearly, projecting my clinical voice across the open-concept room so Preston could hear every single word from the kitchen, where he was aggressively rummaging through the stainless steel refrigerator. "I have officially finalized the real estate closing on a 2-bedroom commercial condominium located on the north side of the municipal district. My professional moving company arrives on the 1st of next month. I am officially stepping down as the resident general contractor and financial underwriter of this physical property." Richard's thick eyebrows furrowed, his large hand hovering motionless over a glass bowl of salted pretzels. "What the hell are you talking about, Julian? You legally own this physical structure now. You can't just abandon your domestic real estate investments." "I am not abandoning the real estate, Richard," I replied smoothly, maintaining absolute emotional detachment. "I am actively exercising my legal rights as the sole registered property owner. I have formally retained the commercial property management division of a reputable regional real estate firm. Starting on the 1st of next month, this residential home will be officially transitioned into a standard triple-net commercial lease structure. If the three of you wish to continue residing inside these physical walls, you will execute a standard 12-month residential tenant agreement and remit the current fair market monthly rent of $2,500 directly to the corporate management portal. Furthermore, my personal auto-draft authorizations for the municipal water, the high-speed fiber internet, and the regional electric grid have been permanently revoked. You have exactly 14 business days to establish those utility accounts under your own personal social security numbers." Preston slammed a heavy glass jar of imported mayonnaise onto the granite kitchen island with a loud, jarring physical clatter. He marched into the formal living room, his face violently twisted in absolute, entitled maternal outrage. "Are you completely out of your mind, Julian?" Preston barked, aggressively puffing out his chest like a territorial high school athlete. "You're actually going to charge your own biological flesh and blood commercial rent to live inside our own family home? Where the hell am I supposed to generate $2,500 in liquid cash every 30 days? My commercial tech startup is entering a vital, highly sensitive seed funding acquisition round. Then I strongly suggest you submit an immediate employment application to the regional Walmart Commercial Center down the highway, Preston, I said without a microscopic trace of familial pity. Their human resources department is actively recruiting evening shift cashiers. The compensation package is $16 an hour. If you maintain a standard 40-hour weekly schedule, you will generate sufficient net income to cover your designated portion of the residential rent, and you will still maintain enough surplus liquid capital to purchase your own imported designer protein supplements. Richard, do something immediately, my mother gasped, dramatically clutching her pearl necklace against her collarbone as if she were experiencing an acute, lethal coronary thrombosis. He is actively treating us like common, transient street tenants. After the massive personal and financial sacrifices we made to clothe and shelter him through nursing school, my father slowly rose from his plush leather recliner, his face visibly darkening into a terrifying, rigid mask of pure, unadulterated paternal fury. He took 3 massive, aggressive strides across the Persian rug, purposefully using his physical height to try and psychologically dominate me. An archaic domestic intimidation tactic that had worked marvelously when I was 12 years old, but fell utterly, pathetically flat against a disciplined clinical professional who spent his night shifts physically restraining combative, chemically altered trauma patients. You ungrateful, cold-blooded, treacherous bastard, Richard growled, his deep voice physically vibrating with rage. You truly believe you can legally dismantle this family unit? You think you can casually walk away from your biological obligations? I am your father. You were my registered financial dependent for 9 years, Richard. I corrected him, my clinical tone completely flat, steady, and entirely unbothered. There is a staggering, legally binding difference, and that historical financial dependency officially terminates in exactly 14 days. I didn't wait for his loud, explosive verbal rebuttal. I turned on my heel and walked calmly toward the dark central hallway. But as my right foot crossed the wooden threshold, the absolute, chilling horror of my family's profound psychological emptiness was permanently laid bare in a single, unforgettable sentence. My mother didn't pursue me down the hall. She didn't burst into genuine maternal tears. She didn't scream that she would emotionally miss her eldest son, or ask if my new commercial condominium possessed sufficient dining space to host our traditional family Thanksgiving dinners. Instead, I heard the crisp, sharp, entirely indifferent physical rustle of heavy stock paper as she calmly reopened her interior design magazine. And then, in a voice as completely detached and frigid as an underground mortuary steel slab, she asked, "But who is going to pay the property tax next month?" I stopped dead in my tracks. My right hand hovered suspended inches from the hallway light switch. A profound, absolute physical numbness instantly washed over my entire central nervous system. It was a moment of pure, terrifying, absolute psychological clarity. In that one microscopic fraction of a second, any lingering domestic guilt, any archaic biological remnants of eldest son duty I still carried inside my soul, instantly vaporized into the cold air. To Eleanor Vance, my physical departure wasn't the tragic emotional loss of a firstborn child. It was the deeply frustrating, inconvenient mechanical breakdown of a vital domestic appliance. It was a completely seized central air conditioning compressor. It was a commercial dishwasher that refused to drain. I did not offer her the dignity of a verbal response. I stepped fully into the dark hallway, feeling like a captive hostage who had finally managed to unbolt the heavy steel doors of an underground compound. Later that same night, at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, the residential structure was dead, perfectly silent. I needed a standard commercial postage stamp to officially transmit my finalized change of address documentation to the State Nursing Regulatory Board. Knowing my father maintained a comprehensive drawer of shipping supplies inside his home office, I quietly slipped across the hardwood floor and pushed his office door open. The room smelled heavily of stale cigar smoke, old financial ledgers, and leather binding oil. I clicked on my specialized clinical pen light, carefully, slowly sliding the top drawer of his heavy mahogany desk open so the metal roller tracks wouldn't squeak. I did not locate the roll of postage stamps. Instead, resting squarely on top of a massive, rubber-banded stack of delinquent credit card statements, I discovered a pristine, heavy-stock manila legal folder marked with a bright red commercial insurance corporate tab. And what was documented inside that pristine folder fundamentally, permanently rewrote the biological reality of my entire human existence. I carefully flipped the heavy manila cover back, the concentrated white beam of my medical penlight illuminating the bold, formalized black typography printed across the top of the official corporate certificate. It was a comprehensive accidental death and dismemberment insurance policy. The primary registered insured documented on the official contract was Julian Vance. The aggregate commercial coverage payout amount was a staggering, mind-numbing $2 million. I stood completely motionless inside the suffocating, stale darkness of my father's home office, my physical breath violently catching in my throat. My eyes rapidly darted down the dense administrative text, actively searching for the formal beneficiary designation line. According to the notarized corporate amendment attached to the back of the legal binder, the primary financial beneficiary had been formally altered exactly 3 weeks prior. It had been legally stripped away from my personal estate and transferred 100% to Eleanor Vance. My clinical hands began to physically tremble slightly, not from biological panic or fear, but from a creeping, profound, absolute human revulsion. I directed the penlight beam down to the primary authorization signature line at the bottom of the legal parchment. There was my designated name, Julian Vance, executed in dark blue ballpoint ink. But as an experienced medical professional who spends hours every single day verifying complex legal patient surgical consent forms, analyzing handwriting cadence and authenticating chart documentation, my trained eyes immediately registered the unnatural, halting physical mechanics of the ink flow. The cursive loops were far too uniform. The ballpoint indentation pressure was entirely static, completely lacking the natural, sweeping, dynamic physical cadence of a genuine human signature. It was a total legal forgery. But it wasn't a clumsy, freehand domestic forgery attempted by my father. I leaned down closer, bringing the concentrated penlight beam within half an inch of the fiber paper. The blue signature had been meticulously traced. Somebody had physically placed a genuine historical document over an illuminated commercial lightbox and carefully, slowly kankied the exact physical dimensions of my handwriting onto the insurance corporate authorization line. My clinical mind raced at maximum capacity, rapidly sifting through decades of personal historical archives to identify the exact source document they had harvested. And then, like a jagged bolt of lightning striking a dark, isolated tree, the terrifying realization detonated inside my brain. The unnatural, sharp downward dip on the capital J, the truncated, slightly trailing finish on the lowercase e. It was the exact, highly unique physical signature I had executed when I was 16 years old, lying helpless inside a preoperative holding bay at the Regional Children's Hospital, severely chemically altered and terrified out of my mind as I signed my mandatory emergency surgical authorization and personal identity release document prior to undergoing an emergency appendectomy. My mother had carefully preserved that yellowing, carbon copy medical record inside her fireproof domestic safe for 15 continuous years. She hadn't saved that hospital document out of sentimental maternal affection or historical nostalgia. She had coldly preserved my childhood medical trauma as a biological financial skeleton key. She had weaponized my adolescent surgical records to legally authorize a $2 million commercial bounty on my adult head. I stood there in the dead silence of the night, physically holding the crisp corporate paper that placed an exact, quantifiable retail value on my biological existence. The clinical math was brutally, undeniably straightforward. As an experienced triage nurse living inside their residential structure, I was worth roughly $80,000 a year in bill coverage, domestic labor, and mortgage utility. But as a completely drained corpse lying inside a sealed mahogany casket, I was worth $2 million in immediate, tax-free liquid capital. My domestic utility had officially expired. I was no longer functionally valuable to them as a resident medical provider, a structural handyman, or an auto draft banker. I was worth substantially, exponentially more dead than alive. A common man would have completely lost his emotional stability right then and there. A common man would have violently kicked my father's master bedroom door off its brass hinges, turned the overhead lights on, and screamed the truth into their sleeping faces until the local subdivision security patrol dispatched the municipal police. But I am a senior triage specialist. When you clinically discover a malignant, highly aggressive internal sarcoma, you do not aggressively poke it with a scalpel and watch the toxic cells metastasize throughout the healthy bloodstream. You quietly, systematically prepare the sterile operating theater for a total, uncompromising, clean physical excision. If I angrily confronted Richard and Eleanor with that legal binder, they would instantly manufacture a plausible domestic lie. They would smoothly claim it was a standard supplemental family corporate investment policy they established to secure my long-term future. They would hire a slick, aggressive criminal defense lawyer, claim familial misunderstanding, and permanently incinerate the underlying physical evidence. I needed irrefutable, undeniable, high-definition digital proof of actual criminal intent. I carefully closed the manila legal cover, placing the binder back squarely on top of the overdue credit card statements down to the exact microscopic millimeter. I clicked off my pen light. I turned around and walked out of the home office, my nursing clogs entirely silent against the polished hallway floorboards. At exactly 8 o'clock the following morning, as soon as my hospital shift formally concluded, I did not drive to my suburban home. I drove my vehicle straight to the downtown apartment complex of my trusted clinical colleague, Marcus. Marcus is an attending emergency room physician at my primary medical center. A brilliant, fiercely analytical, no-nonsense trauma doctor who had spent the last 3 years watching me walk into our clinical units with severe physical exhaustion and frayed scrub tops. When I sat across his kitchen island and laid out the physical and administrative facts, Marcus didn't offer empty, worthless emotional platitudes. He walked directly over to his glass liquor cabinet, poured 2 neat fingers of premium American bourbon into a tumbler, slid the glass across the stone directly into my hand, and picked up his secured tablet. "We aren't involving the municipal police detectives yet, Julian," Marcus said, his clinical voice completely rigid, hard, and entirely analytical. Without a physical body or an undeniable, documented physical delivery attempt, a commercial insurance corporate contract carrying a trace signature is classified as a standard white-collar fraud investigation. It gets completely buried inside municipal court bureaucracy for 3 years. You need to digitally capture the physical actors actively manufacturing and deploying the lethal payload. Together, we immediately drove to a specialized commercial surveillance outfitter situated inside a commercial strip mall 2 municipal districts over. I didn't purchase a standard, highly visible domestic security camera. I purchased a highly specialized, $40 commercial USB wall charger. It looked identically, indistinguishably like the standard, cheap white Apple charging blocks you plug into a kitchen wall outlet to power an everyday personal device. But directly above the tiny metal USB port, concealed inside a microscopic, completely unnoticeable black dot, was a wide-angle 4K pinhole camera lens equipped with continuous audio capture and a cellular Livestream cloud transmitter. Yesterday afternoon, while my mother was out driving her vehicle to the regional commercial grocery center, I walked into our kitchen, unplugged our structural electric toaster, and securely inserted the white charging block directly into the central counter outlet overlooking the preparation island. "Do not unplug this specific charging block, Mom," I firmly instructed Eleanor when she walked through the door carrying the grocery bags. "My secondary hospital communications device is actively charging for my critical emergency shift tomorrow." She didn't even drop her eyes to look at the outlet. To her profoundly self-absorbed, narcissistic mind, it was simply another piece of meaningless, technical electronic clutter generated by the resident maintenance utility worker. I mistakenly assumed the pinhole lens would simply record them verbally discussing the commercial insurance policy. I figured I would capture an audio file of a standard domestic white-collar financial conspiracy. I had absolutely no earthly idea that at exactly 5 o'clock yesterday evening, that tiny white USB charging block was going to actively broadcast a real-time, live-action capital murder conspiracy that involved a ruthless organized criminal syndicate, a staggering offshore gambling liability, and the absolute sickening moral cowardice of the man who legally gave me his last name. Yesterday afternoon, exactly 2 hours before my mother slid that poisoned organic ginseng tonic across the heavy oak dining room table, I was sitting securely inside my parked vehicle 2 municipal blocks away from our residence, shielded from public view by the heavy, hanging branches of a weeping willow tree. I opened the encrypted commercial surveillance application on my smartphone. The live video stream from the kitchen wall outlet popped onto the digital display with terrifying high-definition clarity. The very first physical detail I registered was the heavy, highly erratic, frantic physical sound of pacing leather shoes against the kitchen linoleum floorboards. My father, Richard, was actively pacing back and forth across the preparation island, physically holding his cellular device directly in front of his mouth like a tactical walkie-talkie. The smartphone was administrative set to maximum exterior speaker volume. The physical voice emanating from the tiny speaker wasn't the sanitized, highly polite, administrative tone of a commercial bank teller or a regional credit union collection officer. It was a remarkably calm, low, deeply gravelly physical voice that carried with it the absolute, terrifying, cold weight of a loaded automatic firearm. Monday morning, Richard, the gravelly voice stated. There was absolutely no background ambient office chatter on his end of the cellular connection. No typing. Just the steady, slow, distinct physical sound of ice cubes clinking against a heavy glass tumbler. 9 o'clock sharp. You have the $500,000 remitted in clean, non-sequential commercial wire transfers, or our administrative communications officially terminate. We dispatch a tactical collection crew directly to your lovely suburban residence, and we legally harvest our physical collateral. Richard's face on the high-definition digital stream was entirely, shockingly devoid of biological color. He looked like a cornered, sweating, dying animal. His physical chest heaved violently as he leaned both hands against the marble kitchen island. "Victor, please, listen to the administrative reality," Richard actively begged, his deep voice physically cracking with a pathetic, high-pitched whimpering desperation I had never historically witnessed from him. "I simply require an administrative extension of 72 hours. The real estate market is tied up. I have commercial assets. I maintain a $2 million insurance claim clearing by Tuesday morning. We are permanently done granting administrative extensions." "Richard?" Victor replied with absolute, freezing indifference. "Your boy Preston ran up 500 grand on our private, unregulated offshore sports betting ledgers. He issued his personal guarantee, and you legally co-signed the physical marker. You assured our associates that the Vance real estate portfolio was entirely liquid. Now, either the 500 grand clears our offshore portal by 9 a.m. Monday, or your precious golden boy leaves that fancy split-level suburban structure inside a heavy-duty, commercial black canvas body bag. It is your domestic choice, Dad." The cellular connection went completely dead with a sharp electronic audio spike. I sat completely paralyzed inside the driver's seat of my vehicle, my physical fingers actively digging into the leather steering wheel until my biological knuckles turned completely, starkly white. The sheer, absolute, mind-numbing magnitude of the domestic lie hit my human consciousness with the extreme physical impact of a crashing commercial airliner. The impending municipal foreclosure. The aggressive, endless paternal demands for my graduate school savings. The self-righteous speeches about historical family honor and structural financial hardship. None of it was generated by regional economic downturns. None of it was the result of commercial lending inflation or bad real estate acquisitions. It was Preston, the golden child, the innovative corporate executive whom Aunt Patricia endlessly worshipped and aggressively protected, was a severe, completely out-of-control sports gambling degenerate who had gotten himself completely indebted to a violent, underground organized crime syndicate. And rather than allowing his precious, beloved golden boy to face the legal, structural, or physical consequences of his own completely reckless actions, Richard had personally assumed the criminal liability. He had looked at the massive, lethal $500,000 steel trap closing forcefully around Preston's physical throat, and he had made a conscious, entirely calculated domestic decision. I will legally and physically execute Julian to pay Preston's criminal ransom. He was preparing to murder his entirely self-sufficient, clinical firstborn son just to ensure his youngest son's $300 designer sneakers remained completely devoid of street blood. On the live video feed, Richard slowly, shakily lowered his cellular device onto the marble counter. He slowly turned his head across the kitchen to where my mother, Eleanor, was standing rigid motionless beside the walk-in pantry. "We have to execute the procedure tonight, Eleanor," Richard whispered, his deep voice physically trembling with a dark, hollow, absolute domestic urgency. "Victor's collection crew is entirely serious. If we do not possess Julian's certified municipal death certificate and the expedited commercial insurance corporate claim formally submitted by tomorrow morning, those men are going to physically butcher Preston." Eleanor did not offer a single gasp of genuine maternal horror. She did not fall to her knees weeping at the physical thought of permanently terminating the biological life of her firstborn child. She simply reached her hand directly into her woven leather handbag, pulled out the amber prescription bottle of digoxin, and walked purposefully toward the heavy granite mortar sitting on the island. I actively watched my mother unscrew the white, child-proof plastic cap of the pharmaceutical container. I watched her completely invert the bottle, dumping a massive, unmeasured white pile of cardiac pills directly into the stone bowl. Then, she firmly gripped the heavy granite pestle. The internal audio microphone inside the USB block was remarkably, terrifyingly sensitive. Through my vehicle's sound system, I clearly heard the exact, rhythmic physical scratching audio of the rough stone grinding aggressively against the chemical pills. Crunch, scratch, crunch, scratch. It was the undeniable physical sound of a mother systematically turning her own deceased mother's life-saving cardiac medicine into a physical executioner's weapon for her son. But as deeply sickening, as entirely monstrous as Eleanor's physical actions were, it wasn't my mother who fundamentally destroyed my faith in the human species during those 60 seconds. It was Richard. On the high-definition digital broadcast, my father did not physically assist her in grinding the chemical powder. He did not pour the expensive organic ginseng tonic into the shaker. He walked entirely out of the preparation kitchen and sat down heavily inside his plush leather recliner inside the adjacent living room, perfectly, clearly framed inside the upper right corner of the wide-angle surveillance display. As the harsh, physical grating audio of the stone pestle physically intensified, bouncing off the kitchen tile, Richard reached out his right hand and picked up the television remote control. He did not turn his physical head around to look at his biological partner. He did not issue a verbal command to halt the homicide. He simply aimed the infrared remote directly at the commercial flat-screen display and firmly pressed the volume-up button, holding his thumb down until the blaring, completely artificial audience cheers and electronic dinging bells of a syndicated daytime game show entirely drowned out the physical sound of the lethal poison being actively manufactured 20 physical feet behind his skull. There is a highly specific, exceptionally malignant breed of psychological evil inherent in passive domestic parenting. In clinical psychology, we formalize it as the bystander effect. But when it physically occurs inside a primary biological family unit, it reaches a level of extreme, sickening depravity. It is the specific domestic actor who proudly stands before a criminal court boi tam doan and self-righteously declares, "I never laid a single violent finger on that boy," while entirely omitting the documented historical fact that they stood entirely motionless and actively watched their biological partner physically beat the child within an inch of his life. Sitting squarely inside his leather recliner, staring entirely blankly at the spinning, brightly colored digital wheel on the television monitor, Richard Vance was actively constructing a pathetic, cowardly psychological loophole inside his brain. If my biological fingers do not physically touch the stone mortar, if my physical hands do not pour the organic liquid into the crystal glass, I am completely innocent of homicide. I am simply an exhausted residential family provider watching a television broadcast while my domestic partner administrative resolves our temporary financial liabilities. His absolute, unblinking silence was his formal, legally binding co-signature on my physical death warrant. I watched Eleanor dump the fine white chemical powder into the shaker. I watched her pour the thick, dark green organic ginseng tonic directly over the residue, vigorously shaking the plastic container until the chalky digoxin completely, invisibly dissolved into the expensive drink. I watched her carefully pour the finalized toxic mixture into my favorite heavy crystal glass, meticulously wiping the exterior rim with a completely clean paper towel. I completely closed the digital surveillance application on my device. The smartphone display instantly went entirely black, leaving only the dark, cold physical reflection of my own clinical face staring back at me inside the quiet interior of my vehicle. I sat entirely motionless inside the driver's seat for 5 continuous minutes, listening to the gentle physical rustle of the hanging willow branches against my front windshield. I could have easily engaged the vehicle's transmission right then. I could have driven straight to the municipal police headquarters downtown, walked directly into the primary homicide detective's bureau, and slammed my digital device onto the administrative desk. But my senior clinical ER training actively overrode my biological adrenaline. If I handed regional prosecutors a digital video file depicting a 60-year-old woman mixing crushed prescription medication into an organic health drink, a slick, expensive criminal defense lawyer would instantly dismantle the state's prosecution. They would smoothly present medical documentation arguing that Eleanor was suffering from acute, early-onset senile dementia, and that she was simply preparing her own personal prescription medication inside a beverage she intended to personally consume. Without a documented physical victim, without the undeniable physical delivery of the weapon across a dining table, the digital file was nothing more than a strange, entirely circumstantial domestic home video. I needed the physical actors to commit the absolute, undeniable physical delivery attempt. I needed them to slide that heavy crystal glass across the wood, look me directly in my human eyes, and verbally instruct me to ingest the liquid. I reached my hand down, turned the physical ignition key, and listened to the vehicle's commercial combustion engine roar to life. I smoothly pulled out from beneath the heavy willow tree and drove down the municipal block, parking my automobile in my designated space on the cracked concrete driveway. I walked calmly through the heavy front oak door, kissed my mother affectionately on her powdered cheek, patted my father respectfully on his shoulder, and sat down squarely at the head of the heavy oak dining room table. And now, the historical timeline is completely 100% synchronized. The heavy crystal glass is completely freezing against my right hand. The dark organic ginseng tonic is swirling gently against the polished crystal. Across the heavy oak table, my father's left leg is actively vibrating with a frantic, completely uncontrollable physical panic, his dark eyes rapidly darting toward the hallway grandfather clock every 5 seconds. Tick, tock, exactly 9 hours remaining until Victor's armed collection crew arrives. 9 hours until Richard either formally files my $2 million commercial life insurance claim, or actively watches Preston get zipped into a heavy canvas body bag. I lift the rim of the crystal glass directly toward my biological lips. The entire dining room instantly goes completely, deathly silent. My mother freezes entirely, her metal dinner fork suspended entirely motionless halfway to her open mouth. "Wow, Mom," I say, deliberately letting my eyes flutter closed as I deeply inhale the pungent ginseng aroma. "You finally bought the expensive stuff for me." And right on cue, the golden child aggressively reaches his manicured fingers across the centerpiece. I thought I historically knew exactly how far my father would go to protect his favorite biological asset. But what physically transpires during the next 60 seconds under the heavy oak dining table is going to permanently, irrevocably dismantle the very concept of human morality. The room was so deeply, suffocatingly quiet that the physical hum of the central heating vent sounded like the roaring engine of a commercial jetliner. I sat squarely at the head of the heavy oak dining room table, physically shielding the heavy crystal glass against my sternum like a territorial animal protecting its final winter ration. "Get off the glassware immediately, Preston," I snapped, deliberately injecting my clinical voice with a sharp, selfish, hoarding edge that I had never historically utilized inside that physical house. Mom purchased this exclusive organic ginseng blend specifically for my personal medical stress. You maintain an entire bottle of imported red wine sitting directly next to your dinner plate. Consume your own designated beverages. If I had calmly offered the crystal glass to my younger brother, his highly manipulative, hyperparanoid, narcissistic instincts would have immediately triggered a massive internal alarm. He would have suspiciously inspected the dark green liquid, questioned the underlying sediment, and completely refused the ingestion. But because I actively pulled the heavy crystal back toward my physical chest, because I performed the theatrical role of the greedy, ungenerous eldest brother attempting to monopolize a luxury retail commodity, I completely bypassed his cognitive defenses. In the rigid psychological architecture of an entitled golden child, a hard personal boundary is not viewed as a request for basic human respect. It is viewed as an aggressive, intolerable personal insult that must be instantly, forcefully conquered. Preston's face violently flushed a deep, ugly shade of magenta. He pushed his heavy wooden dining chair back with a loud, jarring physical screech against the hardwood floorboards, standing up to his full physical height and aggressively leaning his entire upper torso directly over the floral centerpiece. "You are such an arrogant, miserable, ungrateful prick, Julian." Preston spat, his bright blue eyes visibly dilating with pure, unadulterated, childish rage. "You sit there acting like you legally own the air we breathe just because your clinical paycheck covered a few delinquent municipal liabilities. Mom underwrites every single domestic amenity inside this physical real estate. Technically, that luxury ginseng tonic belongs to the collective household assets. It is legally mine." "Preston, sit down this instant," my mother Eleanor gasped. Her vocal cords physically cracked with a sudden, genuine, high-pitched maternal terror that completely shattered her delicate suburban exterior. She dropped her heavy silver dinner fork. It clattered loudly, sharply against her pristine porcelain plate. She looked frantically across the polished oak at my father, her wide, trembling eyes desperately pleading for an immediate physical intervention. "Stop him, Richard. He is actively reaching for the lethal digoxin payload." But my father, Richard Vance, did not move a single biological muscle. He sat completely paralyzed inside his heavy wooden chair, his dark, hollow eyes rapidly flicking away from my mother's terrified face, past Preston's extended manicured fingers, and locking firmly onto the antique grandfather clock standing in the central hallway. Tick, tock. Exactly 8 hours and 50 minutes remaining until Victor's Underground Collection Syndicate arrived at our front door. 8 hours and 50 minutes until Richard was legally required to present my certified municipal death certificate and a finalized commercial life insurance claim confirmation, or actively watch his own physical kneecaps get shattered by a steel crowbar. I sat there in the tense, freezing silence, keeping my clinical resting heart rate entirely steady, actively watching the cold, brutal mathematical calculation physically transpire behind my father's sweating forehead. Richard was actively running the domestic triage ledgers inside his brain. If he physically reached out and slapped that crystal glass away from Preston's grasp, the entire homicide conspiracy instantly collapsed. I would immediately realize the underlying liquid was chemically altered. I would formally retain a commercial litigation lawyer, vacate the residential structure, and permanently sever all financial access. Morning would inevitably arrive over the suburban horizon. Victor's armed collection crew would breach the entryway, and Richard Vance would be summarily executed over an unregulated offshore gambling debt. He needed a completely deceased biological asset to legally trigger the $2 million insurance corporate indemnity payout. He heavily preferred that the underlying physical corpse belong to his compliant, utility-grade firstborn son. But in a desperate, lethal financial squeeze, absolutely any biological Vance family body would legally satisfy the secondary commercial beneficiary clauses. I actively watched my father consciously decide that his own pathetic, cowardly biological survival was worth exponentially more than the physical life of his beloved golden child. "Let your brother have a sip of the herbal tonic, Julian," Richard said. His deep voice was remarkably, chillingly flat, completely devoid of any natural paternal inflection or human warmth. "Do not be so damn stingy with the domestic provisions." "Richard, what in God's name are you saying?" Eleanor choked out. Her face turned entirely pale, her jaw dropping open in absolute, staggering human horror as she stared at her biological partner. In that one microscopic fraction of a second, my mother finally, permanently realized the absolute, terrifying truth that I had uncovered inside his home office. There is no honor, no loyalty, and no biological mercy among domestic financial parasites. I shifted my steady eyes back to Preston. He was smiling a smug, highly victorious, deeply arrogant little smile. He honestly believed he was successfully asserting his unearned domestic dominance over a $20 luxury beverage. He believed he was putting his common, utility-grade worker bee brother firmly back inside his designated caste system. He had absolutely no earthly idea that he was actively, aggressively fighting for the exclusive legal right to permanently terminate his own cardiac rhythm. "Fine," I said, entirely stripping my voice of any emotional resistance. I smoothly uncurled my physical fingers, completely releasing my defensive grip on the heavy crystal stem. "If you require the retail commodity that desperately, Preston, ingest it." Preston snatched the heavy crystal glass from the polished oak wood with the aggressive, blinding physical velocity of a striking pit viper. He pulled the heavy rim directly toward his own chest, glaring down at my mother and me like we were common street thieves preparing to physically tackle him for the beverage. "Mine," Preston stated, his vocal delivery dripping with absolute, pathetic, 26-year-old toddler entitlement. Eleanor lunged across the polished oak. It was a completely wild, instinctual, animalistic physical movement. She threw her entire upper torso across the dinner plates, her right hand extending forcefully through the air, violently aiming to physically slap the crystal chalice directly out of Preston's manicured grip. "Preston, no. Do not swallow that liquid!" my mother screamed, the raw, tearing audio physically bouncing off the dining room chandelier. For one fleeting, microscopic heartbeat, I actually thought the domestic psychological game was officially concluded. I figured Eleanor's fundamental biological maternal instinct would forcefully override her insatiable commercial greed. But I had completely underestimated the absolute, sickening physical depravity of the third domestic actor sitting at the oak table. Before my mother's extended fingers could physically make contact with the crystal stem, Richard's large right hand shot upward from beneath the hanging white linen tablecloth. He didn't simply grab Eleanor's extended forearm. He clamped his thick physical fingers completely, violently around her biological wrist, actively squeezing the fragile human bones with extreme, bone-crushing physical torque. I sat 2 feet away, clearly watching Richard's large biological knuckles turn starkly, completely white under the dining room lighting. Eleanor instantly froze mid-lunge. Her physical arms remained completely suspended in the empty air, her breathing turning into short, ragged, hyperventilating gasps as her terrified eyes locked onto her husband's rigid face. An entire, complex legal and biological dialogue physically transpired between my parents in that dead, freezing silence without a single vocalized syllable being generated. Richard's dark, hollow eyes bored directly into Eleanor's soul. His rigid facial muscles delivered the absolute, uncompromising paternal maximum. "If you physically knock that crystal glass onto the hardwood floorboards, the digoxin payload is permanently absorbed into the Persian rug. The underlying financial conspiracy fails. Julian walks out of this residential structure alive. The commercial life insurance settlement remains completely out of reach. And by 9 o'clock Monday morning, Victor's collection crew is going to permanently zip your golden child into a canvas body bag anyway. Let him consume the chemical." Richard gave Eleanor's trapped biological wrist a sharp, highly violent, downward physical jerk toward the floorboards. My mother let out a tiny, broken, whimpering human sound from deep inside her throat. Her physical shoulders completely collapsed. The raw physical terror of Victor's underground syndicate heavily outweighed the fundamental biological urge to preserve her favorite child. She slowly sank back into her wooden dining chair, heavy, silent tears actively spilling over her powdered cheeks as she watched Preston Nguako. Preston, entirely, blissfully blind to the silent physical assault and the lethal domestic pact occurring 3 physical feet away from his left elbow, completely misread the environmental tension. He assumed my mother was simply staging another dramatic, theatrical domestic episode over the unauthorized consumption of an expensive retail grocery item. "You people are absolute, unhinged lunatics," Preston scoffed, rolling his bright blue eyes with extreme, dismissive contempt. "It is literally just an organic health drink." He lifted the heavy crystal rim directly to his biological lips, firmly met my steady clinical gaze with a deeply smug, triumphant, highly arrogant smile, and aggressively swallowed a massive, continuous mouthful of the dark green tonic as if he were actively completing a fraternity drinking dare. I sat there in absolute, unblinking clinical silence, actively watching the dark green liquid completely disappear down his biological esophagus. There is a profound, deeply poetic, chillingly cruel human irony inherent in the exact manner entitlement permanently destroys a human life. Preston Vance wasn't physically collapsing into cardiac arrest tonight simply because of one bad biological decision executed during one isolated family dinner. He was actively destroying his own biological existence because he had been systematically raised on endless, unearned parental permission. He had been meticulously trained from the maternity ward to forcefully take whatever retail commodity his eyes desired. He had been deeply conditioned to believe that personal legal boundaries, financial receipts, and human ownership simply did not apply to his designated caste system. He had been trained to treat my hard-earned clinical possessions as common domestic property, and my verbal protests as meaningless ambient background noise. Richard and Eleanor had spent 26 years meticulously constructing, polishing, and loading that lethal psychological weapon. I simply set the finished retail product squarely on the dining room table. Preston firmly lowered the heavy crystal glass back onto the oak wood with a loud, highly satisfied physical clink, aggressively wiping the residual green foam from his upper lip with the back of his manicured hand. "Extremely bitter," Preston mumbled, heavily wrinkling his nose in absolute physical distaste as he reached for his glass of water. "I have absolutely no earthly idea why you were hoarding that commodity, Julian. It tastes like chalky chemical waste." "It is a highly acquired clinical taste, Preston," I replied smoothly, picking up my silver dinner knife and calmly returning my attention to my roasted vegetables. "Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey." The subsequent historical stretch of time physically inside that suburban dining room felt like an endless, slow-motion crawl through an underground clinical purgatory. The heavy brass pendulum inside the hallway grandfather clock kept physically swinging back and forth. Tick, tock. Heavy silver dining utensils physically scraped against porcelain plates. My father, Richard, consumed his roasted chicken with extreme, highly unnatural, frantic physical velocity, chewing his food as if mechanical speed could somehow outrun the impending, catastrophic legal and biological consequences of his own passive co-signature. My mother did not consume a single microscopic calorie. She sat entirely rigid inside her wooden chair, her face completely pale and hollow, her wide, bloodshot eyes staring fixedly across the wood at Preston, violently flinching at every single minor physical shift of his shoulders, as if she were actively watching an underground physical landmine tick down to zero. I simply kept cutting my roasted vegetables. I kept chewing my food. I kept my clinical triage breathing entirely synchronized. And then, exactly 22 minutes after the physical ingestion of the chemical liquid, Preston's right hand violently slipped off the polished oak. His heavy silver fork dropped onto his pristine porcelain plate with a loud, sharp, shattering physical clatter that caused Eleanor to physically jump out of her seat. Extremely weird," Preston mumbled. His vocal delivery was suddenly thick, slurred, and heavily dragging. He lifted both hands, aggressively rubbing his biological eye sockets before squinting upward at the dining room chandelier. "Why does the interior environmental lighting look so intensely distorted? Everything maintains a massive, glowing, harsh yellow physical halo around it. As an experienced ER triage specialist, my clinical mind immediately formally checked the diagnostic chart. Severe visual disturbance. Yellow-green halos around external light sources. Classic, textbook, undeniable physiological symptom of acute digitalis chemical toxicity. Richard forced a tight, deeply sweating, highly unnatural paternal smile across his rigid face. It is absolutely nothing, Preston honey. You are simply experiencing minor optical fatigue from staring at your cellular device all afternoon. Just consume your protein. Preston physically shook his heavy head from side to side, his breathing visibly shifting into a rapid, shallow, highly erratic diaphragmatic flutter. No, Richard. I feel entirely. He never successfully finished the sentence. Preston's upper torso lurched violently forward over his dinner plate. His biological abdominal muscles contracted with a brutal, involuntary diaphragmatic spasm, and the entire dark green, chemically altered organic ginseng liquid violently ejected from his biological stomach, completely ruining the pristine white linen tablecloth with a thick, toxic physical stain. Preston! Eleanor screamed. It was a completely feral, ear-piercing human shriek. She was already forcefully scrambling out of her dining chair, knocking the heavy oak piece backward onto the floorboards. Preston slid completely sideways off his wooden seat, hitting the hardwood floorboards with a heavy, brutal, sickening physical thud, his $300 designer sneakers twitching erratically against the Persian rug. He went frighteningly, entirely still. His biological breathing physically transitioned into a harsh, wet, rattling agonal gasp, the unmistakable, terrifying physiological sound of a human central nervous system systematically forgetting how to fire the fundamental biological commands required to maintain organic oxygen exchange. Eleanor violently dropped to her physical knees against the hardwood, hysterically sobbing, desperately grabbing Preston's sweating, pale left hand and physically pulling his limp arm against her Sunday church blouse as if maternal theater could somehow forcefully restart a chemically seized cardiac muscle. Richard, do something immediately, my mother wailed, her vocal cords completely tearing. Call the emergency medical dispatch. Call 911. He is dying. My father frantically fumbled inside his trouser pocket, forcefully pulling out his cellular device. His physical biological hands were trembling with such extreme, uncontrollable physical panic that he nearly dropped the smartphone directly into the ruined, toxic green vomit covering the table. But throughout the entire physical duration of dialing the 3 digits, Richard's dark, sweating eyes kept rapidly, suspiciously flicking across the wood directly to me. He wasn't physically looking down at his critically poisoned golden child. He was actively tracking the resident medical professional. He was calculating the administrative risk of the sole surviving human witness. Richard successfully connected with the regional emergency dispatch operator. He sharply barked our municipal street address into the cellular microphone, and then, with smooth, deeply sickening, performative theatricality, he loudly began constructing a completely fabricated domestic legal narrative. My youngest son is experiencing a catastrophic biological reaction, Richard declared into the device, deliberately pitching his vocal cadence into a hyper-panicked, deeply helpless parental register. He must have consumed a severely contaminated retail grocery commodity. It is acute food poisoning. He is violently vomiting and losing organic consciousness. Please dispatch an expedited trauma unit immediately. I sat completely motionless inside my dining chair, staring directly into my father's sweating, lying eyes. My internal clinical temperature dropped to absolute 0. Richard successfully terminated the cellular connection, forcefully wiping the heavy physical sweat from his upper lip with his dinner napkin, as if he had just successfully executed a heroic domestic rescue. Acute food poisoning, Richard? I asked, my clinical voice completely cut through Eleanor's frantic, hysterical sobbing, echoing across the room with the heavy, unyielding physical weight of a falling concrete slab. That is the exact medical narrative you formally submitted to the municipal emergency dispatch? It inherently must be food poisoning, Julian, Richard stammered, aggressively raising his physical voice, doubling down on his archaic parental authority. He was out consuming unregulated food commodities with his commercial associates all afternoon. His digestive tract is entirely seized. I slowly stood up to my full physical height, deliberately placing both of my clinical hands flat against the polished oak wood. If the responding emergency medical technicians treat this specific biological event as a standard bacterial foodborne pathogen, Richard, I said, my voice entirely rigid, cold, and lethal, they will systematically administer standard intravenous saline fluids and antiemetic medications. They will completely waste vital clinical triage time. And Preston's failing cardiac muscle does not maintain sufficient historical time. Eleanor let out a strangled, suffocating human gasp, violently rocking back and forth over Preston's twitching torso. Oh God, Julian, save him. You possess a nursing license. Do something clinical. Tell the responding paramedics the absolute, undocumented chemical truth immediately, Richard. I commanded, firmly locking my unblinking eyes onto my father. I have absolutely no earthly idea what your paranoid, unhinged clinical brain is talking about, Richard roared. His vocal delivery was entirely too fast, excessively loud, and physically vibrating with pure panic. He was aggressively doubling down on his domestic lie because openly admitting the actual underlying chemical reality to responding municipal medical providers meant formally admitting that there was a completely illegal, lethal pharmaceutical substance physically existing inside that residential structure. It meant immediate, aggressive police interrogations. It meant search warrants. It meant criminal court indictments. And whatever terrifying financial debt Victor's underground collection syndicate was actively tightening around Richard's physical throat heavily outweighed his fundamental biological urge to preserve his golden child's physical life. I stepped away from my dining chair, walking calmly around the heavy oak table to stand directly above Preston's sprawled physical form. His biological lips were already visibly turning a stark, terrifying shade of cyanotic blue. His resting heart rate is actively crashing into profound bradycardia, I stated, looking straight down into Eleanor's ruined, mascara-stained face. You maintain exactly 4 clinical minutes before this cerebral hypoxia transitions into permanent, irreversible biological brain death. What specific prescription substance did he physically ingest? Eleanor. Nothing, my mother screamed, her face violently twisting in absolute, manufactured denial. He didn't physically ingest any external chemical substances. Stop lying immediately, I roared. The concentrated physical volume and absolute clinical authority of my vocal delivery hit the entire room like a cracking physical bullwhip. Absolute, terrified silence instantly cracked completely open inside the residential dining room. I smoothly reached my hand into my clinical trouser pocket, forcefully pulled out my specialized smartphone display, tapped the encrypted digital screen exactly once, and physically held the high-definition display directly within 4 inches of Eleanor's widening eyes. A completely pristine, 4K digital video file actively played across the monitor. It was entirely, irrefutably unmistakable. The central kitchen preparation island, the amber prescription bottle, the heavy granite mortar, Eleanor's biological hands systematically grinding the tiny white chemical pills, the thick organic ginseng liquid being actively poured over the toxic powder. And clearly, unmistakably framed inside the upper right corner of the digital broadcast, Richard Vance sitting squarely inside his leather recliner, aggressively vanned to overhead television volume to lawn at the underlying audio of guilt. Eleanor's biological eye sockets visibly bulged to their absolute maximum physical limits. Richard looked like he had just been forcefully struck in the sternum by a swinging steel beam. He physically stumbled backward against the dining room archway. You digitally recorded our interior environmental actions? Richard whispered, his deep voice entirely hollowing out into pure, unadulterated human horror. I actively observed your criminal preparations, Richard, I stated coldly, never lowering the glowing digital screen. And I actively observed you sit there in absolute silence and permit your beloved golden child to ingest the lethal payload. Outside our residential split level, the sharp, aggressive, Rising audio of municipal emergency sirens began to physically echo across the suburban neighborhood, rapidly shifting from a distant wail into an unyielding, predatory physical scream that actively shook our front window panes. The municipal responding medical units will breach that formal entryway in exactly 120 seconds. I said, my vocal delivery dropping into a remarkably low, steady, entirely lethal register. So, I am formally presenting both of you with your absolute administrative options. I deliberately leaned my upper torso downward, physically shifting the glowing smartphone monitor slightly to the left so Richard could clearly, undeniably register every single high-definition digital frame of his own passive co-signature. Option A, I outlined sharply. You aggressively maintain your completely fabricated food poisoning narrative. Preston successfully achieves permanent biological cardiac arrest on this hardwood floor. I immediately hand this unedited digital surveillance file directly to the primary municipal homicide detectives. You will not be administratively explaining a tragic domestic accident to a criminal court boi tam don. You will be formally explaining premeditated first-degree capital murder, commercial insurance corporate fraud, and the documented legal forgery of my surgical consent archives. I paused for exactly 2 continuous heartbeats, letting the absolute, crushing legal weight of the mandatory state prison sentences physically settle over their sweating shoulders. Option B, I continued calmly. You openly vocalize the absolute pharmaceutical truth to the responding attending paramedics the microscopic second they breach that front door. They immediately administer the required intravenous digoxin immune fab binding fragments. Preston successfully survives the toxicological event, and both of you legally answer to the regional prosecutors for what you actually, physically executed inside that preparation kitchen. Eleanor rapidly darted her terrified eyes downward to Preston's shallow, completely agonizing agonal breathing. She rapidly shifted her gaze back up to my glowing 4K digital screen. Then, she looked desperately across the room at Richard. Richard's dark, hollow eyes completely silently begged her to maintain the domestic financial conspiracy. Keep your mouth shut, Eleanor. Victor's body bags. The $2 million. But something inside the rigid, heavily polished psychological foundation of Eleanor Vance finally, completely cracked wide open. 30 continuous years of domestic manipulation, 30 years of prioritizing HOA Garden Club social standing, and 30 years of financial parasitism were instantly, completely pulverized by the primitive, unyielding biological terror of a mother actively watching her biological offspring physically turn cold and gray beneath her own fingers. She completely broke. It is digoxin. Eleanor screamed at the absolute top of her ruined physical lungs, her vocal delivery completely tearing into raw, bloody audio. It is the heavy-duty cardiac medication. It is Grandma's heart pills. Please, Julian. Save his biological life. The heavy oak front door violently flew completely open, striking the internal drywall with a loud, cracking physical impact. A fully equipped municipal emergency medical trauma team aggressively rushed inside the entryway, heavy diagnostic monitors, oxygen tanks, and rigid backboards already physically in motion, closely followed by 2 fully uniformed municipal police officers. Directly over here on the hardwood, Eleanor hysterically sobbed, aggressively waving both of her trembling arms through the dining room air. Please, administer pharmaceutical counteragents. He ingested heavy-duty cardiac glycosides. He requires immediate clinical intervention. I smoothly took 3 calculated physical steps backward into the central archway, entirely removing myself from the active clinical space, allowing the suburban dining room to systematically transform into the exact emergency triage environment it biologically required. Heavy boots scraped against the floorboards. Fast clinical hands executed clipped, highly disciplined medical commands. Intravenous access lines were forcefully established. High-flow oxygen masks were securely deployed, and a portable electrocardiogram monitor began physically beeping with ruthless, uncompromising diagnostic honesty. Once the responding medical professionals successfully stabilized Preston's cardiac rhythm sufficiently to execute a rapid physical extraction to the awaiting commercial ambulance, I smoothly turned my physical body to the senior uniformed municipal police officer hovering inside the formal entryway, deeply confused by the chaotic domestic environment. I am the designated reporting individual who established the secondary administrative communication with the dispatch center. I clearly stated to the officer, smoothly reaching my hand out and placing a solid-state, high-capacity USB storage drive directly into his physical palm. You will urgently require the unedited digital surveillance files contained inside that specific hardware to properly process the impending felony indictments. I strongly suggest your investigative division pay highly specific analytical attention to the digital timestamp where my father physically, aggressively restrains my mother's biological wrist to actively prevent her from intervening in the toxic ingestion. The uniformed police officer's facial muscles immediately visibly tightened into a rigid, deeply professional mask. He firmly gripped the metallic USB drive, cast a cold, analytical glance across the entryway directly at Richard, and then firmly nodded his head respectfully to me. The municipal police officers did not waste vital investigative time issuing polite, conversational inquiries to my parents. They issued strict, non-negotiable physical instructions. Richard Vance and Eleanor Vance were forcefully spun around against my refinished dining room table. Heavy steel handcuffs were systematically, tightly ratcheted completely shut around their biological wrists with loud, sharp, highly satisfying metallic clicks. As the uniformed officers forcefully escorted my parents toward the formal entryway, Richard completely ceased performing his archaic parental theater. His rigid face was violently flushed a deep, terrifying shade of magenta. He aggressively dug the heels of his leather shoes into the hardwood floorboards, actively fighting the officer's physical momentum just long enough to twist his upper torso around and lock his venomous, deeply sneering eyes onto me. "You cold-blooded, treacherous, ungrateful slumlord," Richard bellowed, his deep voice physically shaking the entryway light fixtures. "You deliberately orchestrated this entire domestic legal setup. You completely ruined this family unit. You legally owe us for your entire clinical education. You owe us your professional salary. You owe us this real estate." I didn't offer a single vocalized syllable of emotional defense. I simply stood there inside the warm glow of the chandelier, quietly watching his pathetic, hyper-inflated paternal ego violently thrash against physical steel restraints. And right at that exact microscopic second, the ultimate, most devastating coup twist of the entire historical narrative officially, majestically crossed our wooden threshold. The heavy front door smoothly swung open once again. Stepping completely inside our formal entryway, flanked by his personal executive assistant and dressed in a completely immaculate, bespoke charcoal wool corporate suit that commanded absolute environmental silence, was Arthur Pendleton, the towering, billionaire real estate mogul and regional corporate innovator whom my family historically assumed was my arrogant, highly demanding clinical employer. The entire entryway instantly dropped into an absolute, staggering human freeze. The arresting police officers instinctively paused their physical extraction, immediately recognizing the towering regional titan standing before them. Richard's bellowing vocal cords completely, instantly seized. His dark eyes widened in absolute, staggering human confusion as he stared at the billionaire mogul standing squarely inside his suburban foyer. Arthur Pendleton did not offer my handcuffed parents a microscopic trace of basic human warmth. He slowly dropped his cool, fiercely intelligent gray eyes down to Richard's steel-bound wrists, inspecting the physical restraints with extreme, deeply chilling corporate revulsion, exactly like an executive inspector examining raw sewage on a marble floor. "Julian Vance does not work as a common, utility-grade clinical employee for my corporate holdings," Arthur Pendleton stated. His vocal delivery was impeccably smooth, deeply resonant, and carried with it the absolute, crushing, unstoppable financial weight of an entire commercial empire. "Julian is the primary co-founder, majority corporate shareholder, and executive managing director of Pendleton Concierge Medical Services. He personally designed and manages the entire high-end private clinical infrastructure servicing the elite corporate tier of this regional district." Arthur slowly shifted his cool gaze to a sleek, heavy-duty black leather corporate briefcase sitting securely on the floorboards directly next to the living room brick fireplace. The exact briefcase Julian had carried inside the residence earlier that evening. That specific corporate portfolio resting by your hearth does not contain standard administrative nursing ledgers, Arthur continued, measuring every single razor-sharp word to ensure it systematically completely dismantled Richard's historical sanity. It securely holds $500,000 in certified, non-sequential cashier's checks drawn directly from Julian's primary corporate operating accounts. He personally transported those liquid funds into this physical structure tonight to fully satisfy your youngest son's unregulated offshore gambling liabilities by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. It was intended to be executed as a completely silent, highly generous, finalized retirement severance gift to the parents who brought him into this world. Arthur Pendleton paused, offering Richard a slow, deeply pitying, entirely devastating corporate shake of his head. "You completely foolish, malignant little man," Arthur whispered coldly. "You actively conspired to commit first-degree capital murder against the exact clinical executive who held the exclusive legal keys to your permanent domestic and financial salvation. You just tried to butcher the only golden goose you ever physically possessed." I stood entirely motionless inside the archway, actively watching the absolute, total, unrecoverable psychological collapse of Richard Vance physically occur before my eyes. The biological blood instantly drained from his facial tissue, leaving his skin a horrifying, translucent shade of wet ash. His physical knees violently buckled beneath his trousers, his entire upper torso sagging heavily into the arresting officer's physical grips as the mind-numbing, staggering reality of his own insatiable, arrogant greed permanently crushed his cognitive processing. He hadn't simply lost his residential real estate asset. He hadn't simply secured a mandatory 25-year state prison sentence. He had personally, actively incinerated a multi-million-dollar private clinical fortune that was sitting quietly inside a leather briefcase 10 physical feet away from his favorite recliner. "Julian," Richard whimpered, a tiny, broken, deeply pathetic, high-pitched vocal sound escaping his trembling lips. "Julian, son, please, instruct your corporate lawyer. Establish a domestic legal defense. Remove these physical transient tenants from my commercial real estate property immediately, officers." I calmly instructed the municipal authorities, my voice completely smooth, steady, and entirely at peace. "They are actively trespassing on finalized corporate assets." The uniformed officers forcefully dragged Richard and Eleanor Vance completely out of the residential entryway, their heavy shoes physically scraping across the concrete porch as the heavy oak door firmly, securely latched completely shut behind them. Exactly 3 historical weeks after the physical arrests inside our dining room, I walked through the double sliding glass doors of the intensive care unit at our regional primary medical center. The environmental air was intensely cold, clinically sterile, and smelled heavily of rubbing alcohol, floor bleach, and the continuous, unyielding rhythmic physical beeping of specialized cardiac diagnostic monitors. I calmly walked into room 412. Resting horizontally across the mechanized hospital bed was Preston. The 26-year-old golden child successfully survived the acute digitalis toxicological event, but responding attending physicians were exceptionally blunt regarding his long-term clinical prognosis. If I had actively delayed the administration of the digoxin immune fab fragments by even 60 additional seconds, Preston's biological cardiac muscle would have permanently achieved irreversible necrosis. He had spent 14 continuous days inside an induced coma attached to a mechanical ventilator, and he did not physically emerge from that clinical fire unchanged. His biological skin was entirely pale, completely devoid of his expensive artificial tanning lotions. His manicured hands were deeply bruised from multiple intravenous access attempts, and his physical upper torso was noticeably thinned out, entirely stripped of his territorial athletic posturing. I quietly pulled up a standard vinyl visitor's chair and sat down squarely beside his mechanized bed. I did not issue empty emotional inquiries. I smoothly unlocked my secured clinical tablet, firmly pressed play on the unedited digital surveillance file captured by the USB wall charger, and placed the high-definition monitor directly onto his lap. Preston sat there inside the cold clinical lighting, actively watching the 4K digital broadcast. He clearly watched my mother, Eleanor, aggressively dump the unmeasured handful of Grandma's digoxin pills into the heavy granite mortar. He watched her vigorously whisk the fine toxic powder into the organic ginseng liquid. But the absolute catastrophic psychological shift permanently occurred when the digital timestamp reached the exact dining room dinner sequence. Preston's sunken blue eyes widened in pure human horror as he clearly watched Eleanor forcefully lunge across the plates to physically slap the poison away from his lips, only to be forcefully, violently restrained by Richard's large hand clamping beneath the tablecloth. He clearly read the absolute, cold paternal decision executed on Richard's rigid face. Let him consume the chemical. We require the life insurance proceeds. Heavy, silent biological tears instantly welled inside Preston's hollow eyes, rapidly tracking down his pale cheeks and soaking into the collar of his hospital gown. The heavy, suffocating porcelain crown of the golden child permanently, completely shattered into dust right there inside room 412. For the very first time in his 26 years of human existence, Preston Vance fundamentally, undeniably understood his actual domestic reality. He was never genuinely loved by Richard and Eleanor for his biological human soul. He was never unconditionally protected. He was simply an expensive, highly polished piece of ornamental domestic livestock maintained inside a locked display case solely to generate neighborhood social envy. And the microscopic second his personal offshore gambling liabilities threatened the primary domestic provider's financial comfort, his biological parents summarily led him directly to the underground slaughterhouse. Preston slowly lifted his trembling right hand, physically pausing the digital video file on the exact high-definition frame of Richard's white knuckles squeezing Eleanor's wrist. "Julian," Preston whispered. His vocal delivery was immensely fragile, broken, and completely devoid of his historical arrogance. He slowly looked up into my clinical eyes, preparing to deliver the third, most devastating secondary historical coup twist of our family's archives. "Julian, do you historically remember Buster?" My clinical resting heart rate experienced a sudden, sharp, entirely involuntary physical spike. Buster. He was a purebred golden retriever puppy I had personally purchased during my sophomore undergraduate nursing year. He was a fiercely loyal, incredibly affectionate animal who possessed bright, intelligent eyes. He used to physically sleep at the foot of my mattress while I highlighted massive clinical triage textbooks. When Buster was 3 years old, I returned home from a grueling 48-hour weekend clinical rotation at the county trauma ward to discover his designated dog crate entirely empty. My mother, Eleanor, had manufactured theatrical maternal tears, smoothly claiming that Buster had suffered from an acute, sudden congenital heart block while actively playing in the backyard, and that municipal animal control had already summarily processed his physical remains. I had grieved for that animal with a fierce, quiet human intensity. "What specific historical details regarding Buster do you possess, Preston?" I asked, my voice dropping into a dangerously rigid, entirely uncompromising register. Preston physically choked on a heavy sob, aggressively wiping his biological eyes with his thinned forearm. "Mom completely fabricated that medical narrative, Julian. Buster didn't biologically experience congenital heart failure. It occurred during the vital Tuesday afternoon sequence when Eleanor was actively hosting the Regional Homeowners Association Garden Committee luncheon inside our formal dining room. Buster was securely locked inside the adjacent laundry room, and he kept continuously, loudly barking at the municipal postal worker through the exterior windowpane. His vocal audio was physically interrupting her precious social tea presentation." Preston paused, his pale frame visibly physically shuddering at the historical memory. "I was 12 years old," Preston confessed, his voice tearing. "I was sitting quietly on the carpeted landing of the central staircase. I clearly watched Mom walk into the preparation kitchen, forcefully pull Grandma's amber digoxin bottle out of the medicine cabinet, crush exactly 3 white pills inside a heavy ceramic bowl, and aggressively fold the chemical powder into a raw ball of ground beef. She carried the contaminated meat directly into the laundry room and forcefully fed it to your dog just to permanently terminate his ambient vocal audio. I actively watched Buster physically seize and expire against the linoleum. I maintained absolute historical silence regarding the homicide because Mom purchased a pristine Sony PlayStation console for my bedroom the following morning. I sat entirely motionless inside the vinyl visitor's chair, staring blankly at the sterile hospital wall. A quiet, profound, intensely cold human grief systematically washed through my central nervous system. Eleanor Vance hadn't simply begun experimenting with pharmaceutical homicide 60 days ago. She was a documented, malignant historical sociopath who viewed the active termination of a biological cardiac muscle as a completely standard, highly effective domestic management tool to preserve her precious HOA social standing. That horrific past revelation didn't break my emotional resolve. It permanently, completely diamond-coated my human detachment. The regional state prosecutors are formally offering you a comprehensive legal immunity agreement regarding your unregulated offshore gambling liabilities, Preston. I stated smoothly, actively locking my steady eyes onto my brother. In administrative exchange, you are formally required to execute a sworn legal deposition and appear as the primary state witness against Richard and Eleanor Vance during the impending felony court proceedings. You will vocalize every single documented historical detail contained inside this digital surveillance file, and you will openly testify regarding the historical digoxin poisoning of my animal assets. Preston did not hesitate for a microscopic fraction of a second. He firmly, decisively nodded his pale head. I will execute the legal testimony, Julian. I will permanently bury them. It was the very first genuinely selfless, legally accountable human action Preston Vance had ever executed inside his adult existence. 3 months later, the formal criminal court trial officially commenced inside the Municipal Superior Court District. The presiding corporate prosecutor, Sarah Jenkins, was an absolute, unyielding woman of steel who completely refused to entertain the aggressive defense lawyer's endless, pathetic attempts to negotiate a reduced plea bargain based on familial misunderstanding or diminished mental capacity. When Preston sat squarely inside the witness box and openly, tearfully testified regarding the underlying offshore gambling markers and the historical digoxin execution of my canine asset, any lingering Boitam Doan sympathy permanently vaporized. Richard and Eleanor Vance were formally convicted on all felony counts. The presiding municipal judge sentenced both domestic actors to exactly 25 continuous years in state prison without the administrative possibility of parole. The microscopic second the final judicial gavel forcefully cracked against the mahogany sounding block, I actively exercised my absolute legal rights as the sole registered owner of the suburban real estate asset. I did not attempt to retain the physical structure as a commercial rental property. I fundamentally refused to ever allow my biological lungs to physically inhale interior environmental air that maintained historical geographical contact with their psychological emptiness. I retained a professional commercial demolition and environmental cleanout firm. The following morning, heavy diesel work trucks breached our cracked concrete driveway. Armed with sledgehammers, heavy-duty pry bars, and massive commercial dumpsters, disciplined workers systematically completely stripped the residential split level down to its raw wooden framing studs. They physically ripped out the refinished oak dining table where the lethal trap was set. They violently dismantled the heavy mahogany desk inside Richard's home office where the forged insurance binder was historically archived. And substantially more importantly, I actively instructed the heavy excavator operator to forcefully deploy his hydraulic steel claw against the pristine white wooden perimeter fence enclosing the front garden. The exact physical fence where Eleanor Vance had historically leaned her powdered shoulders for decades to actively project her fake suburban matriarch identity to passing neighbors. The heavy wooden slats violently splintered into rough, jagged matchsticks with loud, cracking physical audio, completely flattening the underlying imported hydrangeas into the municipal dirt. I formally listed the underlying cleared municipal real estate parcel for immediate commercial liquidation the exact same afternoon. Because I actively priced the underlying dirt at a massive financial loss specifically to expedite the structural purging, the property escrow successfully closed in exactly 72 hours. The carpeted flooring inside the Terminal 4 International Business Class Departure Lounge at JFK Airport was completely, peacefully silent, perfectly insulated from the aggressive, frantic physical chaos of the public commercial concourses below. The environmental air smelled wonderfully of rich, dark-roasted espresso beans, crisp leather seating upholstery, and impending geographical freedom. I sat squarely inside a plush wingback chair overlooking Gate 14, actively watching massive commercial passenger airliners systematically accelerate down the concrete tarmac and smoothly lift their heavy physical wings toward futures their human pilots actively, consciously selected. I unlocked my specialized smartphone device and opened my primary corporate mobile banking application. The digital monitor instantly updated with flawless administrative efficiency. The finalized, cleared real estate proceeds from the expedited municipal land liquidation, heavily combined with the substantial quarterly profit distributions generated by Pendleton Concierge Medical Services, actively pushed my net liquid capital reserves past the multimillion-dollar financial threshold. I possessed sufficient liquid corporate assets to establish a brand new, cutting-edge clinical concierge facility in absolutely any municipal district across the global map. I was completely exempt from the financial black holes of domestic bailouts, credit card arrears, and historical mortgage defaults. I smoothly minimized the banking portal and opened my primary digital communications contact directory. My clinical thumb slowly scrolled down the alphabetized typography. I located the formal digital contact file registered under the specific name, Richard Vance. I did not open the message archives. I did not inspect historical voicemail recordings. I firmly pressed the red administrative icon, Delete Contact. The digital entry instantly completely vanished from the memory storage. I smoothly scrolled downward to the formal contact file registered under the specific name, Eleanor Vance. I firmly pressed the identical red administrative icon, Delete Contact. The underlying data permanently evaporated into empty digital space. Then, my clinical thumb scrolled downward until the digital monitor framed the specific contact file registered under the name, Preston Vance. My physical finger completely paused, remaining suspended exactly 1/8 of an inch above the glowing glass display for 3 continuous, deeply analytical heartbeats. I did not execute the permanent deletion protocol, but simultaneously, I did not authorize an active communications channel. I smoothly swiped my clinical thumb to the left and firmly deployed the secondary administrative command, Archive Contact. The digital entry was systematically completely removed from my active visual display and securely filed away inside an isolated, deeply silent digital storage folder. It was the physical manifestation of an absolute, unbreakable human boundary. I officially forgave my younger brother for his historical participation in my domestic utility caste system, but I fundamentally, permanently refused to ever resume my archaic biological role as his self-sacrificing resident autodraft banker or general medical contractor. If Preston successfully rebuilt his human existence through honest municipal retail labor, I would quietly celebrate his biological survival from afar. But my corporate checking accounts, my emotional reserves, and my physical residential threshold were permanently locked. I smoothly locked my smartphone device and placed it securely inside my tailored breast pocket. Then, I deliberately reached my right hand over to my left biological wrist. I slowly unbuckled the scuffed, heavy black nylon band of my historical Apple Watch, the exact personal electronic device I had utilized inside my parked vehicle to actively monitor the 4K surveillance broadcast of my mother grinding the lethal digoxin payload. I lifted the physical hardware off my skin, walked calmly across the carpeted departure lounge, and firmly dropped the electronic casing directly into the deep, dark interior of a stainless steel municipal airport waste receptacle. It hit the underlying plastic liner with a dull, finalized physical thud. Julian Vance officially ceased existing as a common domestic utility commodity. I was officially the exclusive managing architect of my own human existence. To the incredible, highly resilient American women sitting across this digital YouTube platform today, specifically those of you who have crossed your 45th year of life, and most particularly those of you who have spent decades selflessly operating as the unacknowledged, deeply exhausted domestic caregiving infrastructure for toxic family members, I want to leave you with one fundamental, absolute psychological truth. Human society, traditional suburban culture, and overbearing extended relatives like Aunt Patricia will continuously, aggressively attempt to noise so your cognitive processing with the archaic, highly romanticized domestic myth that blood is inherently thicker than water. They will actively weaponize your fundamental biological empathy, your historical family archives, and your maternal protective instincts to systematically coerce you into functioning as a completely silent, self-sacrificing human shock absorber for their endless financial miscalculations, their emotional IKY, and their insatiable domestic greed. They will falsely label your desperate demands for basic human respect as selfishness, and your hard legal boundaries as family betrayal. That entire historical narrative is a completely fabricated, malignant domestic lie. You fundamentally cannot choose the biological parents who successfully processed your entry into the maternity ward. But you maintain the absolute, uncompromising, legally protected human right to actively choose to survive them. You maintain the absolute legal right to demand itemized financial receipts, execute quitclaim deeds, and legally protect the underlying physical roof over your biological head. And substantially more importantly, you must understand that the ultimate, most devastating human revenge against a toxic domestic structure does not require staging loud, aggressive, screaming verbal confrontations inside a suburban living room. It does not require hiring expensive criminal defense lawyers or seeking violent physical retribution. The greatest, most majestic act of self-preservation you will ever execute is simply, quietly pushing your heavy dining chair back from their polished oak table, standing up to your full physical height, walking completely out of their formal entryway, and permanently refusing to take another single biological sip of the lethal psychological poison they keep aggressively trying to pour into your existence. Let them hold their precious HOA garden luncheons inside an empty, foreclosed dirt lot. You maintain a flight to catch. I want to take this specific moment to express my profound, deepest personal gratitude to every single one of you who remains securely seated across this digital broadcast until this exact final timestamp. Your continuous, dedicated viewership and phenomenal empathy truly mean the absolute world to me. Have you ever personally faced a similar, deeply exhausting utility-grade dynamic, a contested inheritance dispute, or a malignant financial manipulation within your own biological family structure? How did you successfully execute your personal boundaries and secure your own geographical survival? Please, share your itemized historical stories inside the public comments section directly below. I actively read your clinical journeys. And please, do not forget to forcefully hit that like button and firmly subscribe to this corporate channel so you never miss the impending clinical chapters of this ongoing human journey. Stay strong, protect your permanent receipts, and never apologize for securing your own existence.